Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I was bemoaning last night that there's a great shortage of fun, but thanks to Tom Goulding, who's working this conversation behind the scenes, and his choice of music, you feel as though you've just been invited to a rather hip after party. So welcome to more than an after party, a think-in with Jim Al-Khalili, a thinking which tries to answer the question, or we're going to try to answer the question, what is the job of the scientist? Now, I'm going to give you a slightly roundabout introduction to Jim, because the last working dinner that I had before lockdown, the last time I had to go out as a journalist for one of those dinners where people give you a background briefing on a subject, was with the founder of DeepMind, Demis Hassabis. And the truth is that when I arrived there, I didn't know who anyone was in that scientific community, but I did know who Jim Al-Khalili was. I was like, oh, there's Jim Al-Khalili, who is, of course, probably the best known communicator of science in this country, as well as being a professor of physics in his own right. And we had this rather interesting moment where you had one of the great innovators in the world of AI and possibly the best communicator in the world of science, exchanging on the problems of the media and science. And I have to confess, I shrunk rather in the midst of that conversation. And I fear, Jim, I'm going to shrink a little bit in talking to you this evening, because you describe your latest book, The World According to Physics, as being a way for people who are passionate and knowledgeable about physics getting engaged. And then you have a description about other people who I think you describe as having got off to the wrong foot, got off on the wrong foot with physics. I'm afraid one of those people. So go gently with me. I know that no one here needs a kind of masterclass in Zoom, but the point about a think-in is it's the opposite of what Jim does a lot of the time. It's not supposed to be an experience where Jim broadcasts to the grateful nation. It's supposed to be a moment where everyone weighs in and shares what they think, whether it's on the job of the scientist, the way in which public policy is created in response to expertise, whether it's the great mysteries and myths of science itself. Please just, weigh in on the chat. We have a loosely enforced rule, which is no questions. But frankly, if you've got a point of view or even a query, I'm sure that Jim is going to help you fix it. My colleague Liz Mosley is here on the chat, and she will make sure that your thoughts are woven into our conversation. So please do. Jim, listen, thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure.
I suppose the thing that I wanted to start, actually, if we could, with the question we set ourselves: what's the job of the scientist? And your book covers the whole of humanity and, frankly, the whole of the universe and beyond. So forgive me if I start with Downing Street and 2020. It's very small of me, I know. But I wondered what you'd reflected was the job of the scientist in the light of what we've seen in 2020 and in the handling of the pandemic.
Well, for all the years that I've been communicating science, I've talked about the importance of scientists coming down from their ivory towers, explaining to the wider public what they do, why they do it, why it's funded, inspiring the next generation of scientists and engineers, or the usual stuff about why we communicate what we do. I do it because I just enjoy explaining stuff. I derive as much pleasure from explaining science as I do doing the research myself. But I think that has completely changed now. Since the pandemic, what has become apparent is just the absolute importance of having a scientifically literate populace. And by scientifically literate, I don't mean that we all know what happens when you fall into a black hole, or we all know how atoms can be in two places at once, much as I'd love everyone to know more about that. But it's the public I need to understand how science works. And I think that's what's become apparent when you've got the scientific advisors at these briefings with the Prime Minister or with the Health Secretary, talking about uncertainty in science, talking about the fact that we didn't know then, but we know more now. being able to admit mistakes, which is, how science works. So it's not just, the subject matter of science and sort of embedding it into popular culture, which is, is a passion of communicators like me and Brian Cox, Alice Roberts, those scientists, who are in the media. We want to see people talking about scientific discoveries in the same breath that they talk about sports or politics or music or art or history. That, I think, is sort of happening, but it's teaching the world how science works and why we should trust science that is becoming a very important part of science communication.
And Jim, what do you think about the culture clash between science and politics? I mean, you've lived your life in some ways in the culture clash between science and the media, which must have its own joys. But what about science and politics? Are they just unnatural bedfellows?
Not necessarily. I mean, sometimes, politicians who you wouldn't think would get it, would understand how science works, surprise us. We had a science minister a few years back, David Willits, David Two Brains Willits. So clearly his middle name shows that he's a smart guy. He was almost universally admired by the scientific community because although he came from an arts and humanities background, he understood how scientists work. And I think, yes, we can criticize politicians, and I think I say somewhere in my book towards the end, scientists admit their mistakes, and if we didn't admit mistakes, we wouldn't learn anything. Wouldn't it be refreshing if politicians would admit their mistakes? In fact, I think Matt Hancock this morning in an interview, I think with Good Morning Britain, he said, yes, we made mistakes. And I thought, crikey, it's politicians admitting that, what's going on? So I think they are strange bedfellows, but I think it's the conversation between scientists and politicians need not be people speaking different languages altogether.
But there's something, the reason why I just want to push this in terms of understanding, one of the things that's really wonderful, and sorry, I'm now going to just sort of gush uncontrollably about how brilliant the world of physics, the world according to physics is.
Just carry on.
It's not, I occasionally have those moments where I think, look, I'm scientifically illiterate and I'm going to go and buy something, and I buy some incredibly kind of great looking tome, and you can always tell it's been read up under sort of page 52. The thing that's wonderful about your book, Jim, is that it's not a way of just telling us what science tells us. It's a way of understanding the way scientists think. And the thing that I'm fascinated by is there's a certain relish in mistakes. That mistakes are the way that the last generation of scientists get sort of thanked and given their marching orders,
right,
and the next generation of scientists move in. And how do you communicate an acceptance of evidence-based research and then the frailty of our knowledge? Because that seems to me to be what you're showing us in the way in which scientists think.
Yeah, it's a difficult balance, because I think of people not trained in science, when you say, well, we don't know, or we're uncertain or about something, we may be wrong, there is that temptation among some people who, not non-scientists, to say, well, if you don't know, how can I trust you about anything? And that leads to this issue about, even if you have evidence, tomorrow another theory can come along to disprove you. And therefore, my opinion is better than your theory, or my opinion is better than your facts. And so the sort of debates that we're seeing taking place over social media. So it is a difficult path to tread, to get across the fact that scientists are not certain about things, because our theories are only the current best that we have about how the world works. But at the same time, that doesn't mean we don't know stuff. I use an example in the book, and I say, if I drop a ball from a height of 5 meters, it will hit the ground after 1 second. Won't hit the ground after half a second or 2 seconds. No, 1 second. I know this because science tells me. I know this because a formula tells me. Galileo worked it out. It's never going to change. This is a fact about our world. So even though we say we should never be absolutely certain, prepared to change our minds in the light of new evidence, that doesn't mean we don't know stuff. So it's a balance.
So can I, but, you know, I said, Jim, we're going to want to try and bring in as many people as possible. Already, firstly, I should just say that there's an amazing thing when you start reading Jim's book. Often I read books and I know that I'm taking sides, you know, with certain people. When you read Jim's book, you don't even necessarily know what the argument's about to take sides on. So I'm aware that in having this conversation too, I might be leading the conversation in a way that's completely unhelpful to where everyone wants it to go. So do weigh in and let me know what you really want to talk about, and I'll make sure we get there. But I just wanted to pick up on two things while we're talking about the relationship with science and the day-to-day. I wanted to bring in Francesca Harris, if I could, because Francesca challenges in a way that seems quite human, Jim, which is, you know, if you're a big success, you know, if you're kind of quite secure, then maybe it is quite attractive to be able to say, look, I've made some mistakes. If you're new into your career, it's much, much harder to do that. And then I want to come to Tony Pasternak because he makes a point about Sage and independent Sage. Francesca, are you there though? Do you want to?
Yes. Hello. Hi.
Hi.
So I'm an early career researcher, so I'm a PhD student, and I'm speaking not necessarily from, I just feel that there is an attitude within the scientific community that you can sort of admit those mistakes, but only once you've made it enough in your career, and then you get respected for it. And I can't remember exactly the case, but a couple of years ago, there was a big Nature paper that came out, and there were lots of mistakes that turned out within the data. And someone admitted that on Twitter, and I just remember this huge thing of like, oh, it's amazing, it's awesome that they said that there was this accidental thing that happened. But if you're a young researcher, that's something that could ultimately ruin your career, and you also don't necessarily feel the confidence in being able to actually say I made a mistake. I had my first paper that came out, I had an error that was made on one of my figures that meant that I had to republish a corrigendum, and I got a lot of confusion from that corrigendum. And I think, yeah, it's just a personal thing, as you would say, James, but personal experience is not always as...
Sorry, no, the personal experience is great. Can I just ask you one thing, Francesca? What's a corrigendum?
Oh, apologies. So a corrigendum is the republish in the mistake. So you say, once you've published your article in a peer-reviewed journal and you realise that that's got a mistake in it, you have to say to the journal, I've realised I've made a mistake, and publish something which is called then a corrigendum to say to the readers, this is the mistake that's made. And it was only minor, but it comes up forever now as something which I made a mistake in. And I think, yeah.
Yeah, you make a good point. First of all, I should say, if you make a mistake in a paper, very often that's the paper that gets most highly cited because everyone wants to weigh in and tell you that you've made a mistake. So that contributes towards your citation. But no, you are right. You know, science is still a human activity, and scientists still have pressures of getting your PhD, getting a postdoc position, getting a grant, promotion within academia, you know, having your peers respect you. So of course, like any walk of life, there's that pressure. If you make a mistake, not to sort of highlight it too much. In an ideal world, you know, people like Stephen Hawking, I think even in A Brief History of Time, Stephen Hawking talks about how he made a mistake and how, you know, he then changed his mind. If only there was a journal where people could recant their mistakes, it wouldn't be one. You're right. That's an ideal scenario, and it is easier, you know, to say you made a mistake. But good science is about making mistakes. There's you know, the fact is, if you never make mistakes, we don't progress. It's a shame that, you know, we have people who view that as a weakness, even within the scientific community. But that I guess that's a reality.
Just to let you know, Jim, when I was listening, because I was saying to Jim before we got on, actually, I didn't read The World According to Physics. I listened to it, and it's a particular pleasure because Jim narrates it. So you kind of, it feels very personal. Fun enough, as I was listening, I was actually weighing the issue that Francesca raised, which was we're in the process of redesigning our website at Tortoise. And I suddenly thought, you know what? We don't make enough of our mistakes. We don't actually show people, here are where our mistakes are. And then I wondered, should we have a section that's called kind of screw ups and blunders or mistakes and misunderstandings? And of course, I'm caught on that because on the one hand, it's the honourable and right thing and edifying thing to do. I'm also well aware it's probably going to be the most successful page on the website. So what that might tell you is something to totally worry about. Can I bring in Tony Pastor now? Tony, I don't know whether you're there, just because you make a point, and to be honest with you, I actually don't even understand what it means, but you said, Sage repeatedly broke 3 of Crystal Donnelly's 4 principles of synthesizing of evidence. This contributed to independent Sage. Jim, that might mean something to you. It doesn't entirely mean to me.
No, I would like to have some more clarification of what that means as well, I think.
Tony, you there? Yes, far away.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, yes.
Okay. Well, I remember back in March, I stumbled over Crystal Donnelly's work. And so I think Independent Sage had just formed, or maybe it was in April, but inclusiveness, rigorous, transparent, and accessible. Those are the 4 words for synthesizing evidence. In other words, pulling everything together to try and make a case to advise, in this case, the government what to do. At times, they were breaking all 4 of those. I don't know how much was forced upon them by the government to be like that, but you know, we saw Independent Sage rapidly formed and is still running, and they've got a lot to run with, of course. By the way, in terms of mistakes, are people aware of the Journal of Irreproducible Results? That's a journal of scientific humor where you can go in and admit the things that you thought were true and nobody else could.
That's a brilliant.
It's absolutely fun. Yeah. I think, you know, I've been involved to some extent superficially with Independent Sage in that I stood in for Alice Roberts, who hosts their weekly Friday lunchtime briefings while she was away filming. I did so, and you know, I know a few people on Independent Sage. I also know a few of the scientists on the various Sage committees. In fact, a number of them have been guests on my Radio 4 program, The Life Scientific. You know, Patrick Vallance was a guest a few years ago. I mean, the scientists themselves they're doing the science. I tend to feel that, you know, if there's a perceived lack of transparency or perceived, you know, ignoring some evidence, and I think part of that is in the translation between the scientists and the policymakers and the politicians, and part of it is other sort of politics that probably the scientists don't want to get involved in. All they can do is present the evidence as they see it. They can try and get across what the scientific method is about. They say, look, this is just a model. This is a model that makes assumptions. The assumptions that, you know, so many people will die if we don't do anything. Very often, once that, it's not Chinese whispers, but when that gets carried through to politicians and then through to the media, those who don't have a scientific training don't get the nuance of how science is working. Part of it, I guess, if the scientists are to blame for anything, I think it's not communicating clearly enough, not anticipating what they have to explain, and maybe producing maybe more clear PowerPoint graphs, PowerPoint slides as well. So communicating their ideas clearly is maybe where they've not done a very good job. But in terms of integrity of showing how they work and the evidence and transparency, I don't think it's the Sage Committee's members' fault per se.
Jim, can I go for a little bit of a handbrake turn here? Because there's something about trying to define the job of a scientist, which is, I'm sure, infuriating to anyone who is a scientist, because there's so many different kinds of scientists. It's a sort of silly question in the first place. But you do something really wonderful in the book, is you do give us the different, not just disciplines of scientists, but if you like, the different temperaments, going all the way back to Aristotle and Archimedes. You know, they approach things differently. And you have this wonderful description at one stage of someone who's lost their keys on a dark street. And either you're the scientist who looks for the keys underneath the lamppost where there are pools of light, or you're a scientist who looks for the keys in the areas between the lampposts where the streets are dark. And will you just explain a little bit what you were trying to describe there, and what the different, you know, worlds of science are that you're capturing there?
Yeah, well, it's probably easiest to explain it in the context of my own field of physics. Most of science tends to, that most of the knowledge we gain about the physical universe that we gain through the scientific method tends to be incremental. And so, you know, we know stuff, we build on it, we take it a step further. It might need tweaking, sometimes it needs adding to, but every now and again, there's what Thomas Kuhn talked about as a paradigm shift, you know, a complete revolution in science. And, you know, there are the scientists who will play it safe. These are the ones, you know, as you mentioned, James, the analogy of, you know, you're walking back home in an evening and you got to get home, you realize you've lost your keys, you've got to retrace your steps. The pools of light under the lampposts are a smaller fraction of the path of where you may have dropped your keys, but that's where you can look. So you look there in the hope that you will find your keys there, but there are much larger gaps between the lampposts of darkness where your keys are more likely to be, but much harder to find. So in physics, those who carry out research that can be experimentally tested, that can add incrementally to our knowledge of the universe, they are looking under the lamppost. They hope to find what they'd like to find, and sure enough, and that increases things. But then there are those who search in the dark, who are coming up with exotic mathematical theories like string theory or theories in cosmology, where we don't even know how to carry out experiments to test those ideas. To the extent that, you know, many scientists will say, well, that's not even science. If you can't test empirically through observation or through gathering of data and evidence your theory, your idea, then it's philosophy, it's metaphysics. I explain that in the book. I don't think that is true. I think it's just, we just have to be more imaginative to try and test some of these ideas. You do need those searches in the dark, because chances are you won't find the keys if you only look under the lampposts.
So let's get deep into the dark, right? And can you help us with dark matter?
I can give it a go, absolutely. Well, first of all, two things to say. First of all, dark matter shouldn't be confused with dark energy, which is a completely different thing. Both have the words dark in them. In both cases, it's a misnomer. Dark matter really should have been called invisible matter or transparent matter. Basically, it's stuff that's out there pervading the whole universe that is made of something. It has a gravitational pull. In fact, dark matter holds galaxies together, and there's more of it than there is of normal matter. By normal matter, I mean atoms and the stuff that make us, that make planets and stars and gas clouds. There's this dark matter out there that is necessary for the universe to behave the way it does. We have ample evidence that we can't explain the universe without it, and yet we don't know what it's made of. The thing is, it's invisible because it doesn't interact with light. It doesn't absorb electromagnetic radiation. It doesn't emit it. So light just passes straight through it. In fact, dark matter would pass through normal matter very easily, because actually most stuff, including our bodies, is empty space. You learn at school that atoms are mostly empty space. They're just a tiny nucleus with electrons buzzing around the outside. The reason when I slam my hand down on the table, it doesn't go through, is because the electrons in the atoms of my hand are interacting with the electrons in the atoms in the table. Like charges repel. Yes. So that's an electrical repulsion, which is essentially the equivalent of this force, the electromagnetic force, which is what light is. And so dark matter doesn't feel this electromagnetic force. So it can pass through normal matter as though it wasn't there. So not only is it invisible, we can't catch it. We can't grab hold of it and look at it and study it and see what it's made of. And yet we know it's there. And we're designing all sorts of experiments to try and suss out the new particles that it could be made of.
And then will you just explain dark energy?
So dark energy is even a more stupid name for something we don't understand. We didn't know it existed until 1998. We've known for 100 years that the universe is expanding. It's getting bigger. That's not that things are moving away from each other, but the space in between galaxies is stretching. And it's Einstein's theory of relativity predicted that. Edwin Hubble, the great American astronomer, observed galaxies moving away in every direction, so he confirmed it experimentally. So we've known the universe has been getting bigger for nearly 100 years, but we assumed the expansion was slowing down. Gravity was putting the brakes on it. It's a bit like stretching a spring.
Yeah.
And we thought, well, if there's enough matter in the universe, then gravity will eventually stop it expanding, cause it to recollapse in on itself in what's became known as the Big Crunch, the end of the universe. Well, in 1998, it was discovered that, in fact, the universe is expanding ever more quickly. I won't go into the details of how, but basically astronomers were looking at very distant galaxies, saw the universe is expanding more quickly now than it was in the past. So the universe's expansion isn't like a spring being stretched. It's more like blue tack. Right. You pull it and it gradually gets easier and easier to pull. So the universe is expanding ever more rapidly. And what is it that's winning the battle against gravity, that's pushing galaxies apart ever more quickly? It's some form of exotic energy. We've called it dark energy for want of a better name. Again, it's another one of those concepts that we are still grappling with. It's still a mysterious concept that we're trying to understand.
So and for me, there is a kind of line to this questioning, which is that I understand the scientists or the physicists that are working underneath the lampposts, right? I can see that they're trying to understand the mechanics of things that they can see and prove, right? The physicists who are scrabbling around, Jim, in the dark for their keys, the thing that I find harder to understand is what is the question that they're trying to answer?
Well, they're not. I mean, if you're a pure mathematician, then you're just playing around with abstract concepts and formalism, and you're not necessarily that bothered that is the way the universe behaves. A theoretical physicist is sort of halfway between these searchers under the lamppost and the pure mathematicians, in that they're trying to develop mathematical models that they hope is the way the universe behaves. So they are trying to explain phenomena. You know, if you're trying to understand working in a field like string theory, which is, you know, what are the ultimate building blocks of the universe and how many dimensions of space are there? It's very mathematical, it's very abstract, but they're not just doing it for the hell of it. There is a question they want to answer, which is, you know, how do we unify all the forces of nature? How do we unify all the particles, understand what they're made of? So they are asking questions about reality, but the theories they're coming up with, we don't yet have a way of testing. We can't design an experiment to say, yet, is string theory right or wrong? But they're hoping that it describes the way the world really is.
I should just point out that I'm imagining this works a very good joke, but Michael Zaspiro has kept on reminding you, Jim, that the keys are only in one place, which I presume is a reference to the fact that some atoms can be in two places at the same time.
Yes, that's probably a quantum joke. Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so can you just explain to me? So this is the problem you've got when you've got someone who is not even that good at history running this conversation, is that I don't understand the joke of atoms being in two places. What does that mean?
Well, if people know anything about quantum mechanics, they'll know it's a theory that describes the subatomic world, the world of the very small. It developed in the 1920s, so around about the time that, you know, Edward Hubble was discovering that the universe is expanding. But here is a description of the world of the very small, not the world of the very large. I've spent my career in quantum mechanics, using the equations, the rules of quantum mechanics to understand the nuclei of atoms, so the tiniest possible scales beyond anything we can actually see with our eyes. And it's a very different world to the everyday world. In the quantum world, things are fuzzy. They don't have a definite, they don't have sharp edges. And one of the things that has been popularized in quantum mechanics is that an atom can be in what we call a superposition, which means it can be in two quantum states at the same time. That may mean it has two energies at the same time. It may mean something as stupid as it's spinning both clockwise and anti-clockwise at the same time. You know, don't try and visualize this. This is not about, you know, people who've tried to understand quantum mechanics just get a headache. It works, however.
Right.
This is not a theory that's going to be overthrown. Quantum mechanics works, and without it, we wouldn't be having this conversation over Zoom because quantum mechanics explains semiconductors, it explains chips, and therefore the whole of modern electronics. So it works. But at its heart, it has these counterintuitive ideas. An atom in a superposition can also be somehow spread out to exist in two or more different places at the same time. And when you observe that atom, you force it to make up its mind. I'm using plain English words here, but for this to make any sense at all requires many years of study. Which is why popularizing quantum mechanics is sort of fun, but in an evil way, because cats in boxes, dead and alive at the same time. Everyone sort of heard those sort of popular culture explanations, but to actually understand what that is telling us about the subatomic world is very subtle. We can do the maths, we can do the solve the equations to describe the world of the very small. But quantum mechanics is the only theory in all of science which doesn't have a well-defined narrative to go alongside the maths. Normally we talk about in physics, theories and ideas. There's a mathematical equation, there's experimental data that confirms it or not, and then there's the story that those mathematical symbols mean. In quantum mechanics, we don't know yet what those symbols mean. We can't agree on a single interpretation.
There are a number of conversations while you're talking, Jim, that are going on in the chat. One is about how we educate ourselves to be scientifically literate. There are a number of people who want to go back and understand, is this piece of blue tack going to snap? What happens with that dark energy? And I'm going to come back to Emma Champion on that in a moment. But can I just pick up on your point about explaining quantum mechanics is fun, but in an evil sort of way. I know a little about being a journalist and reporting on the world of politics or reporting on the world of business in a way that infuriates exactly the subject that you're most interested in. And I'm just interested to know, as a communicator of science, what's the thing that scientists find most infuriating about you and the Life Scientific and the way the media, even the kind of knowledgeable media, engages in the world of science?
They don't. They all love me. I mean, science communication, I have to say, has changed dramatically in the last 25 plus years that I've been involved in it. When I first started as a young academic, saying to my senior colleagues, I want to give that talk to school kids, or I don't mind being interviewed by that radio reporter who wants to know about such and such, or I want to write an article in a newspaper. They felt somehow I was selling out, that I was, oh, Jim, you're research active, you're publishing papers, you're a serious scientist. Don't waste your time communicating it to the masses. That has now completely changed. Most academic scientists, even if they don't want to be involved, even if they don't have the nerve maybe to talk to a journalist, they see the importance of communicating science. But I think one thing I can say to your point is that I might give the impression that if you find the right words, if you remove the jargon, you can explain anything in science. And actually, a lot of science is just very, very hard. I'll give you two quick examples. One is the great American physicist Richard Feynman, who was interviewed after winning his Nobel Prize by a journalist who said, can you tell me what you won the Nobel Prize for, in a soundbite? He said, young man, if I could, I wouldn't be worthy of a Nobel Prize. But I had a personal experience of this when I interviewed Sir Peter Higgs, the father of the Higgs boson, on the Life Scientific some years back. And I asked him if he could explain what is the Higgs boson? I said, can you explain it in 30 seconds? And he said, no, I'm afraid I can't. I said, okay, can you explain it in a minute? And he thought about it and he said, no, I don't think I can. I thought, oh, this is great. This is great. This is really, we're not getting anywhere with this program. But then he went on to explain, he'd spent all his life trying to understand this. And, quantum field theory that leads to the ideas of the Higgs boson and the Higgs field is incredibly complex, incredibly difficult concepts. You can't explain it so easily. So you can't always, some science some ideas you can get across simply enough. Sometimes you can just pick out the, you know, the important features that you want to explain, and that's enough. But you shouldn't give the impression that anyone can do any science.
Yes.
I think anyone can do some science, because as you mentioned at the start, James, science is so broad. It could be anything from, you know, watching birds nesting on a cliff to trying to isolate DNA, to solving equations, to building some structure. Everyone can have a skill set and contribute to science. Just being curious about the world is being scientific. But some areas of science are just hard.
One of the things I loved in the book was your reference to the fact that there was a whole bunch of scientists who wanted the Hadron Collider, the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, not to find the Higgs boson, because then there would be a whole branch of science that would suddenly open up.
Yes,
you know,
no, absolutely.
So,
you know, that's boring. Well, you know, who wants to find the Higgs boson? We predicted that. Wouldn't it be great if it turns out it doesn't exist? Then everyone, you know, back to the drawing boards. Nobel Prizes all round.
Amazing. I want to make sure I bring some more people. And I see that Mel Gilroy has said, if the keys are in one place, then you know you're at a party in the suburbs, which is a whole different subject for the conversation. Emma Champion, though, Emma, you, and I see you also made a comment on the Pampas bush growing in the front. Emma, will you come in though? You asked, I saw a note about what happens if the blue tack sort of rips, i.e., you know, where are these universes going? And I'm going to come to Sam Houston too, who asked the multiverse question. So Emma first.
Yeah, hello. I love the simplification of it, because we can all understand a spring expanding and we can all understand blue tack stretching, but blue tack, when you stretch it, eventually breaks. It disintegrates. Is that what's projected to happen, likely to happen? What would that mean? Where will it go?
The honest answer is we don't know. It could be. I think it's actually there is a version of explaining the future fate of the universe called the Big Rip, and you know, everything would. I mean, at the moment, space is only expanding and expanding ever more rapidly in the empty spaces between galaxies. Within a galaxy like the Milky Way, nothing is expanding, you know, because gravity is strong, you know, because matter is close enough together and dense enough that it's stopping any dark energy doing its trickery. But we don't know in the very distant, you know, billions and billions of years into the future, when galaxies all move away from each other, to some extent, what happens with this dark energy? How does it evolve in time? Does it change? Does it start stretching within galaxies, within matter, within atoms? It really is. I mean, the answer is we really don't know yet. There are multiple theories suggesting where this might end up.
So, and Jim, can I just bring in Sam Houston too, because we ran a piece about a year or so ago, actually, about the multiverse, this argument about that. And it was one of those wonderful pieces, like listening to a kind of Stephen Hawking speech, where for about 5 minutes afterwards, you can't get over how clever you are. And then it's sort of,
and then it's gone.
You can't remember what it is. So Sam, do you want to weigh in on this? Are you there?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I slightly
Hi, Sam.
Sort of amateurish question, but I was captivated by the film Interstellar, and you know, and the concepts that were sort of explored. I found it utterly thrilling. The idea that time moves differently in different parts of the universe, and also they explored the idea of multiple universes, and I found that, and then also they tried to say something about black holes. I'm not a scientist, I know nothing about any of that stuff, but I wondered if you'd seen the film and would have any comment on any of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the film, and I'll tell you one of the reasons why. I mean, you know, Matthew McConaughey's great, and it's a great story, but also one of the producers of Interstellar is a guy called Kip Thorne, who is also a Nobel Prize winner in physics. He won it a few years ago for discovery of gravitational waves. He is also one of the world experts on relativity theory, and actually a good acquaintance of mine. I interviewed him in a program I made for BBC4 a couple of years ago called Gravity and Me. And he made sure, as producer, you know, and sometimes these sci-fi films have scientific consultants who say, "Oh no, you can't do that," you know, you know, that breaks the laws of physics, and then the producers and directors say, "Oh, okay, thank you very much. Anyway, we're going to go and do this because it's cool." Kip Thorne made sure that everything in Interstellar is within what's allowed within the laws of physics as we understand them now. So it doesn't break any laws of physics, and I love it. So the ideas of wormholes, the time when Matthew McConaughey goes to this, lands on this planet that's orbiting a supermassive black hole, because of the gravitational field of the black hole is so strong, time runs more slowly there. Gravity slows time down. And of course, I mean, it's too late to worry about spoilers. The film's been out for long enough. But when he goes back to Earth again, of course, many years have gone by on Earth when only hours went by for him. It may sound crackers, but that is exactly what would happen were we to orbit around a supermassive black hole. So, and the idea of the multiverse is also, I have to say, the multiverse idea is a bit like string theory. It's one of those ideas which is very intuitive from a theoretical point of view. It helps explain, some mysteries, like how come our universe is just right for us? That gravity isn't too strong, that stars and planets can form and life can form on at least one planet. It may be that our universe is one of almost an infinite number of parallel universes or bubbles floating around in the multiverse. So it's a very attractive idea, but it's one where we still don't know in any way how to test it experimentally. So this is very much a searches in the dark. The multiverse idea, it's attractive. It may be right, but we don't yet know how to test it.
Jim, can I, Sam, thanks, Jim. Can I love that. I'm going to go and look up Kip Thorne after this. That's quite a, I imagine that's quite a claim to fame amongst the Nobel Prize winners. And it's certainly a brilliant pub quiz question. Which Nobel Prize winner has been involved in the production of a Matthew McConaughey movie?
Absolutely.
But Jim, can I ask you, this is another sort of slight switchback, so allow me. We started off talking about the job of scientists as regard politics and decision making. And we talked a little bit about the job of the scientist as regard truth and an understanding of mistakes. One of the things that the world according to physics, I suppose, doesn't do, because perhaps it doesn't feel as pressing right now, is how does the world of the scientist and how does the world of the physicist coincide with the moral impact of what science does? And I suppose the reason I ask that is, as well as being very excited about how science is transforming our lives, we're also quite frightened by what it's doing, and particularly in the age of AI and AI warfare, what scientific innovation is going to do to human society. And I wondered how you think about the job of the scientist as regard to what science will do to humans.
I think scientists probably lost their innocence after the Manhattan Project. Many of the physicists who worked on the atom bomb, really, many of them actually left science altogether because they realized you can't just be finding out nature's secrets without questioning what that might lead to. Even though science itself is neither good nor evil, it's completely neutral. It's just knowledge. And knowledge about the world. Enlightenment is always better than ignorance. So I never buy this argument that was better left undiscovered. But scientists do have a responsibility now, in the same way that medics have always had, with the Hippocratic Oath. You have a responsibility that what you are uncovering about nature could be used for evil rather than for good. But on the other hand, we have to make sure we make this distinction between science and the technology that builds on that scientific knowledge. Scientific knowledge in itself is not good or bad. It's how we make use of it. And that is a responsibility not just of the scientists, but of the politicians and the policymakers and the funders and wider society. We are all part of the decision-making process of how we put that science to use.
And Jim, I just wondered, lots of people may have seen there was this film, The Social Dilemma, which looks at the intersection between sort of the technology engineers on the West Coast. But in the end, it doesn't really point the finger of blame at them for the unwelcome consequences of social media. It points it at the business model, right? And I wonder, when you look at science and the risk around science. I want to come back in a moment to the way in which we as adults become more scientifically literate, but I'm interested to know what you think are the checks on scientists that are built into the way in which science works that thinks about these human impacts, whether or not that's in the training of scientists, in the approval of scientific innovation. Because one thing to say, look, it sits with politics and government, but it also sits with the discipline too.
Yeah, and absolutely not enough has been done in science on policing what we do, exploring the moral, the ethical dimensions of what we do, and the implications of, we can't just say, well, look, I'm just discovering E equals MC squared. If you go off and build atom bombs, that's your problem. I didn't tell you to do it. But we have facilitated the use of science in technologies that we might not want the world to go in. So I think a lot more needs to be done in teaching, not just teaching the science, how we uncover the knowledge, but how we do the science alongside the scientific method is, I think, this moral responsibility of all science. I mean, some probably more than others, but of all scientists to think about the implications of what they do. But at the end, we want to know how the world works, and we shouldn't be stopped from doing. I mean, it's different. when people, for example, developing gene editing techniques.
Yes.
The Nobel Prize for chemistry was given this year to Doudna and Chartier for CRISPR. This is the method of snipping a bit of DNA and removing a gene. Wonderful advance. It could help us cure lots of genetic diseases. But on the other hand, it can be used for germline editing and all sorts of evil things, to the extent that Jennifer Doudna, one of the discoverers of the technique, actually stepped out of the lab and said, I'm not doing the science anymore because I need to tell the world to stop and wait and think and discuss and debate, is this the direction we need to go? So there are certain areas of science where scientists are best placed because they understand the implications of what they're doing. They are in the best place to put a pause on what they're doing, to stop and reflect and think whether that's the way we want to go.
And without being sort of too personal about this, presumably this sort of sits at least a little heavily on you, because one of the complaints about politics and society as regards technology is that the truth is the politicians and most social commentators just don't have the technical know-how to appreciate where one thing is going after the next. Presumably you also think to yourself, actually, I can see the potential implications of some of these things that others perhaps in the media or in public life may not see. So how do you say at the beginning of the book that you're not, you don't take sides in some of these scientific arguments. Presumably there's some cases where you do take sides.
Well, I don't take sides in, whether string theory or loop quantum gravity is the correct theory of everything, or, I don't take sides in what is the correct interpretation of quantum mechanics. But I do appreciate that, with my science communication hat on, as a broadcaster, Life Scientific gets 2 million listeners every week. There is a huge responsibility there. And while, I'm doing more than just interviewing scientists and, tell me about your work and your life and how you got there and your contribution to the world. I appreciate that as a fellow scientist, what I want to draw out of them are some of these aspects. It's not just about keeping that particular individual honest, but it's about exploring what are the wider moral implications of what they do. So yes, I think explaining how science works, I'd like to think I try and weave into my science communication. I enjoy the talking, as you can probably tell, I enjoy talking about the black holes and the dark energy and so on, but I appreciate that's a luxury, and that's not all my job should be, given the platform that I have.
So I'm going to, as I said, I'm going to want to bring in a couple of people. I want to bring in Jane Ann Fox, if I might, because she just asked this very succinct question about science and its moral imperative. Are you there, Jane Ann? And I'm going to come to Richard Caldwell and engineered solutions after that. Jane Ann. Are you there?
Yeah.
Yes, hello. Hi.
Hi. Hi, Jim.
Hi.
I was just saying that it's so wonderful to, I hear you all the time on Radio 4, and now it's like we're in the sitting room with me. Or
I know. It's
I
great.
love it. Oh, I'm
I'll
enjoying
put
it.
the kettle on.
All right, good. So I'm a teacher, an educator, and I have been for many years. I'm in the humanities side, and I'm interested in asking you if you think that there is or should be a moral imperative amongst scientists and the teaching of science. My experience in working with scientists, science teachers, and mathematicians is that they are very much in their own world, and they are, generally speaking, and this is probably you would be an exception in my experience, knowing you now for a number of years. They're more interested in their own work and conveying it than they are in actually teaching and considering the outcomes. So there you go. That's my question.
Thank you. I think my answer is that science is so broad an activity that there is room for all sorts. There are some scientists who, just the way our brains are wired up, there are some who are of more benefit to humanity by, keeping their head down, not worrying about what they're doing, sort of being sort of completely and utterly focused on their area of research. There are others who can zoom out and see the implications of different areas and what that might mean and what technologies might develop from that. It absolutely takes all sorts. I don't think any one person should be everything. Not every scientist should have that moral imperative to explain what they do, to think about the implication of what they do, and also be sort of digging into the depths of their field.
Jim, thank you so much. I just wanted to say, Nia John has just posted in the chat just an amazing thing where she said, I think I spent all of last week delivering technology ethics workshops to primary schools. So certainly these are things that people are starting to think about, part of the Welsh curriculum. That's really interesting.
Great.
Yeah. Jane Ann, will you forgive me just because of time? I'm just going to see if because Richard Caldwell had asked this point about engineered solutions. Apologies, Jane Ann, I hope you understand. Richard, are you there?
I'm here. Yeah, just thinking about the bridge. I mean, between science and actual execution, and that bridge being called engineering, and that if you look at much of what's happened around COVID, it's not actually around the core science. It's around, can you actually make this happen? Can you actually do this? At a very simplistic level, it's one thing to know that you can make a bridge once. Another to actually physically implement one reliably under all conditions and one who's going to work in the real world. Yeah. Interested in Jim's thought on that.
No, absolutely. I mean, I tend to use science as a shorthand for meaning science and engineering. So, discovering the knowledge and then putting it to use, go hand in hand. I have to say, Richard, that my son, who is now 28, he's a patents attorney. When he was choosing what he wanted to do, I was sort of hoping he would follow my footsteps into physics, but he chose to do electronic engineering. And his rationale for that was, Dad, you can do the deep thinking. I want to do something useful. And that was his distinction between science and, I mean, it's a fun way of making that distinction, but you're absolutely right. So much of what we call science is not in fact science. The knowledge that we've gained through the scientific method, it's putting that knowledge into implementation to develop something that, that rather than just knowing stuff, what do we do with it? So absolutely, engineering is, which is why I try and get as many engineers as I can on the Life Scientific. But we can't call it the Life Scientific and Engineering. It just doesn't roll off the tongue otherwise.
Right, exactly. The Life Re-Engineered is a whole different subject. I wanted to come to one final point from Nico MacDonald, if I could, Jim. Just, it takes us perhaps all the way back, and it traces the conversation we've had in some ways, the way in which scientists engage in moral questions in the real world versus the universe, truth, politics. But Nico, do you want to make your point about politicians not respecting the scientific method, but to an extent, scientists not necessarily respecting the political method? Nico, are you there?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, clearly during COVID, but more generally in what I call a more technocratic political era, people have been calling on science and scientists to justify, well, I mean, they would say it, give evidence for, but justify their positions around things like global warming or lockdown or mask wearing and so on. And I'm not expressing a view on any of those things. But typically, I'm finding that people are calling in the science without really understanding the scientific method. So, for instance, around the Great Barrington Declaration, for instance, they say, you know, they don't want to hear from Sunetra Gupta or the other authors. They just want to hear from people who say, you know, scientists who justify lockdown. So they don't appreciate the scientific method involves open debate and informed critique. Obviously, that's more within science, but it should be publicly. And also, scientists who intervene in politics don't understand what I call the political method. So on Newsnight last week, Sir Mark Walport was saying that we should do everything we can to keep the COVID numbers down. Now, no politician would ever say that or do that because they have to balance a whole bunch of factors, and it's ridiculous to say you should do everything to defeat the disease. So I think we need to have more of a divide between those two things. And by the way, I love Life Scientific.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think 1 minute left. So
right. You make a good point, Nico. I think those scientists like Sir Mark Walport, who was a past chief government scientific advisor, people like Patrick Vallance, they understand more than most scientists the clashes. I think they know that scientists can present the scientific evidence, but the scientists aren't elected. It's the politicians who are elected in a democracy. And it's the politicians who have to make decisions, and the decisions don't just rely on the scientific evidence. They rely on economics, public acceptability, and a myriad of other issues that a politician has to grapple with. But I think when scientists disagree, you know, if there's a group, you know, you mentioned the Barrington Declaration and a group of scientists who are maybe questioning whether lockdown was the right way to go about things, that in the end is about science and scientists gaining a consensus based on the evidence to what they think is the most sensible way forward. Science isn't about certainty, it's about uncertainty, it's about making predictions, it's about models. And the scientific advisors and the SAGE group of scientists, these are the people who have to, not the politicians, these scientists are the ones who have to look at the evidence coming from different directions and decide on what is the consensus, what is the most likely best way forward that they then present to the politicians. Then it's in the hands of the politicians to decide how to devise policy. The scientists can only present the evidence that they have based on, you know, what most scientists work on. If, you know, climate change is a very clear example. 97% of climatologists say humans are damaging the climate, and just 2 or 3% say no, then chances are humans are damaging the climate. With something like COVID, of course, because it's new and there's so much unknown, there is bound to be more controversy and more debate and argument about the best way forward.
Jim, listen, I'm sorry, we could really get into that, and as you could probably guess, I'm having a much better time than I should be allowed. So I'm going to try and bring this to an end. I wanted to say one thing, which was one of my sort of great heroes in journalism was my first editor at the FT. He's now the chair of the Tortoise editorial board, a man called Richard Lambert. And I once asked him, what does he most admire? And he said, accessible scholarship. And I was thinking about the fact that what you do on the Life Scientific, what you do in these books, you know, like, you know, The World According to Physics, is it's not just that you make science, frankly, so exciting, right, and so full of possibility, but that you open it and make it possible for us to reach it. And that is such an incredible thing.
I don't do it altruistically, I should say, James. I do it because I enjoy it. You know, if people enjoy it, great, but I do it because I love doing it.
Well, we are delighted to indulge you. We'll keep on indulging you. Keep doing it. We'll keep indulging you.
Thank you very much.
To say a huge thank you. It's been really wonderful listening to you. We can't thank you, hug you, pat you on the back. We can wave in your general direction. But thanks very much, Jim, and I hope hope to see you again soon.
My pleasure. Thank you everyone for joining in. Thanks. Bye-bye.